panelists. We are embarking straight on to the next paper, which is talking about the same, reading from the title. It's Don Williams from the Smithsonian Institute, who will talk about gap fillers, flexible adhesives for wood conservation. Can I ask you to come forward? You are over here.
Well, it's good to have been invited back to pretty much continue the conversation from 15 years ago. Those of you who have heard me speak before know that I tend to enjoy interjecting humor into my talks, but I must admit the topic of gap filling and flexible adhesives for wood may have been a challenge I've not been able to overcome in that regard. These are not scientific observations. They're experiential and anecdotal observations that I think have proven useful to me. And let me see which one of these works. Okay. When we think about the objective of our discussions over these days, it has to do with fractured wood for the most part. Now, whether that fracture is intercellular or simply along glue and join lines is not especially relevant for the work that I've been doing, but nevertheless, it is, I have found it exceedingly useful to apply a decision-making framework for the solution of the problem. And this is a model that I've been using. Some of you are probably already familiar with its demonstration, but it is a set of three competing pairs of dynamics that go into the resolution of the problem, such as the nature and needs of the object are competing often with the nature and needs of the user. We have a perfect desired outcome of the particular project along with technical limitations, and finally we have the intractable competition between resources at our disposal and our ethical constraints. I consider each one of these six points of consideration to be at least theoretically equal. The balance will change from instance to instance depending on the circumstances of the problem. Obviously, when we're trying to deal with this issue of voids in a solid construct, one of the first things we have to think about is filling the gap. I mean, that is part of the point, and hence the title of my talk. Second is we need to consider the flexibility of it, because if we are not attentive to the rheology of the fill materials in comparison with the substrate materials, we are seeking and sowing the seeds of disaster. If we choose materials that are too stiff or stiffer than the rheology of the wood, given the circumstances we're operating under, we are not only doomed for that system to fail, but we are doomed for it to impart additional damage. Whether that is catastrophic remains to be seen. I have new bifocals, and they're exactly wrong for this particular opportunity. When we deal with gaps and flexibility, we're very often talking about issues of flow, which is what I have emphasized in my observations for today and sort of the anecdotes and the mock-ups that I've done to sort of demonstrate that. And given the fact that I'm emphasizing flow, I have disregarded, admittedly arbitrarily, things like gesso paste or micro-balloon PVOH pastes, such as the Red Devil gap filler, one-step spackling, and things like that. And in the end, this whole issue of flexibility can be determined not only as was just shown, but also through mandrel tests, which I'll be including in my paper after the fact. In addition to filling the gap and being flexible, we want to impart some sense of structural integrity to the object. And ideally, we can define, again, based on the model that I use, what does structural integrity really mean? I tend to distinguish the ability of something to stand on its own versus its required ability to support some other element. The chair of a leg, for example, the join between a chair and a seat rail of a leg has a very different sense of necessary structural integrity than does a panel that is essentially free-floating and supported. I also wanted to consider applications by which we could continue on with further steps in the treatment. In other words, visual compensation or topographical conformity, whatever. The fill itself is not the last step, and we need to make sure that a fill that we use is compatible with whatever comes next before the final product. We would obviously like, as was just mentioned, fills that are stable for a lengthy period of time. Ideally, they would be centuries, but I think in a more practical term, if we can get several decades out of a treatment, we're doing well. And finally, we would like that object to be intruded into with as little problem as possible in the future. It needs to be retreatable. Whether it is entirely reversible and removable is another discussion for another time. But certainly we need to readdress and reintrude into the object with as little commensurate damage as possible. Just refreshing our memories as to the functional zones with any adhesive systems. We have the integrity of the adherens, which in this particular case is 2 pieces of wood. We have an adhesive and its ability to remain integral in between those 2 pieces of wood, and the adhesive's ability to achieve affinity with the adherens themselves. And that can be either through specific or mechanical adhesion. It really makes no difference for the model, but there does have to be some continuity to all 5 of these zones of function, or they don't work. Now, there's a basic premise that I use in terms of exploring this issue of gap filling and flexible adhesives, especially the gap filling part, is that if we can size or seal all the gluing margins, we have a great deal of latitude as to what we use as the filler, as long as we are not inculcating our material into the substrates. You know, we have a fairly wide range of options that we can pursue, and I think that it's virtually limitless. Certainly, I have not begun to even explore the margins of it, much less the limits. But if we can size and seal, have an isolating barrier on those margins of the adherens, then we can pretty much go with anything we want based solely on the performance of the material itself. Here's an example that I'm trying to point out, is that this area here of the isolating barrier is, I think, far more important in terms of the mechanical performance, or lack thereof, than simply retreatability. And I think it's critical that we choose isolating barriers that have some affinity for the adherent, some affinity for the adhesive, not too much, because if it's got too much for one or the other, then it's not a really good isolating barrier. And I made a point of identifying the isolating barriers that I used on these various systems that I'll be showing to you in just a couple of minutes. We've all are familiar with hide glue. It was just spoken of. Its main concern, obviously, is its ability to swell and shrink given the amount of moisture. This happens to be a container of 350 gram weight strength glue that I just mixed up into a fairly typical furniture making, furniture conservation, wood conservation consistency, which was about 1 part of dry glue to about 4 parts of water. And you can see that it has fully engorged. And one of the instances of my thinking having changed in the past 15 years is that I formerly would gravitate toward the higher number strength of animal hide glues because they are by definition exceedingly strong. Virtually all of them are stronger under perfect conditions than most epoxies that we have. But as I realized that the issue of their strength is countermanded by the fact that as they dry, they shrink and impart tremendous tensile tensile stresses into the matrix of the glue. In fact, while I haven't tested it, it's certainly conceptually possible to me that a stronger glue can yield a weaker joint simply because of the shrinkage. Now, I prepared this glue, cooking it twice, refrigerating it overnight, and poured some of it into this paper cup. And as you can see, it has shrunk down, and it's not too surprising that you see some shrinkage here and then along here. But then when you look down into it straight from above, you realize that most of what was formerly glue is now void. And in fact, you can see, well, let me put my glasses on here. I think you can see there's this stupid thing. I hate computers. They always do what you tell them to do. You can see a fracture that has been induced by the drying stresses of the material itself. And this is writ large in objects when you have a gluing margin that is too thick. Now, one of the seductions of hide glue, hot hide glue, is that we think it becomes solid at a fairly early stage of the drying solution, but in fact, it's just gelation from cooling. And even though it doesn't flow and has a very high rubbery character to it, well, you know, it sort of feels like a solid or will be a solid, but in fact, it will not. It will form a webbed matrix, which is a real problem. And it's a little hard to see that, but there is a fair bit of gap right here. I took a bunch of oak pieces that were 6 inches square and snapped them in half, then restrained the ends with an equal distant void. And on the face of this, where the glue was flowed in, you can see that there's a bit of there's a very, very substantial meniscus there. But the real issue and the real risk of catastrophe is when you flip it over and you see complete and total voids that are widespread underneath. Well, if I put in a glue mixture that was composition of 25% solids and 80% liquid, as that liquid evaporates, you're eventually going to have a void of 80% if the dimensions are restrained or retained. So I have come to the conclusion that hide glue-based filler systems are simply unacceptable under any circumstance. If I have something more than a reasonably tight gluing margin, I move on to something else. And I've seen this actually in treatment. Objects that have come in, this was a tripod table, and this leg has completely become disassociated with the post. And on these gluing surfaces, everywhere that is glossy, that is someplace where the glue did not adhere. It simply shrunk back and formed a film on the substrate. So in the end, if you think about the areas that are glossy versus the areas that are not, this had probably somewhere between 5 and 10% gluing surface area, which is a recipe for disaster regardless of how strong that glue is. It is not going to hold. Now, one alternative that I could use, again, is backing down from the exceedingly high-strength glues to a much smaller, much lower-strength glue, is to go with, instead of 315, to go with 135. And I will say that the uptake of water into dry hide glue is a linear graph, which I'll include in my paper. That as you plot out the gram weight strengths, the uptake of water into them to full saturation is nearly a perfect line. But a solution that I do use on occasion where I'm gluing something and I'm not entirely sure that the margins are really tight is I'll mix up a 2% polyvinyl alcohol solution as my base waterborne solution. It's a problem to deal with sometimes in preparing that solution, but to that I will add a very high amount of hide glue, cook it twice, and then to that I'll add glycerin for additional flexibility. The polyvinyl alcohol imparts a tremendous amount of flexibility and tenacity, overcoming the brittleness of the glue. And then finally, if I have to do some filling, I will add an appropriate amount of micro balloons to give it the raw stiffness. But this is sort of a little bit of a divergence because this is a material that doesn't really flow very well. It's very paste-like. Now, as we move on to other systems that are available to us, in fact, quite convenient, we have emulsion systems. And I just did something very simple with a very readily available commercial PVA emulsion, and again, filled the 1/16 of an inch gap that was originally in the broken board. And the thing that's fascinating to me is that there is virtually no void at the surface. The topography remained almost perfect, but what there is a lot of cobwebbing and a lot of voids under the surface, which again means that this is a fairly small cross-section of adhesive system. There's also the issue of the impending brittleness and discoloration of the PVA emulsion. Our friend and colleague Steve Koob argues, and I think persuasively, that it's due to the virulent nature of many of the industrial surfactants that are used in the preparation of PVA and other emulsions. I would assume that if we wanted to make our own, we could. And I do, on occasion, make my own emulsions with acrylics and other resinous materials. But the issue being, again, the shrinkage and the cobwebbing and the voiding within the matrix of the glue, which, again, I tend not to like to do this. I happen to see this a lot in treatment, that people slather in PVA or other similar glues, thinking that because they're heavy-bodied in the liquid form that, they're going to stay put. Well, they don't. Now, as we move on to rigid reactive systems, there's a whole range of them, and in terms of rheological performance, there's not really a substantial difference. They tend to be very similar. They react in place. They tend not to shrink. They tend to be very, very hard and rigid. And I will say that I made a point in preparing for this not to really deal with araldite very well, and this morning's talks sort of made me glad because they dealt with araldite rather extensively. But I would also recommend that you take a look at the paper by Mark Anderson and Michael Podmaninsky from the Wood and Artifact Group of 1990, where they dealt a lot with araldite as a bulked araldite, carvable araldite, as a void compensation and structural conservation. It's very good. I don't need to revisit that. But what I was wanting to look at is what can we do with an actual liquid epoxy. This is the one that I tend to use a lot of. I find it to be an exceedingly high quality, high performance,
marine-based epoxy. It's readily available, not hideously expensive, and I tend to use the very slowest hardener because I want as much working time as possible. Because again, I want flow, I want penetration into voids onto the sized and sealed surface. In this particular instance, I took the void and completely filled it dry, full of dry wood flour. This was all oak, and then you can see that it is completely filled and then cleaned off, and just wicking in with an eyedropper the mixed up West System epoxy. I'm not advocating that product. It just happens to be what I use a lot, so you have some reference of
the product, and just simply let that material wick itself down to the bottom of the void. The void has been sealed with animal hide glue as the isolating layer, so that there's no epoxy actually going into the wood. It is merely intimately conforming to the topography of the fracture itself. And that level of mechanical interlocking has, in my observation, been enough. I haven't done an Instron test on it, but in my experience, it has been more than adequate. And as you can see at the top, after full curing, there is virtually no void whatsoever. So we do know that this material simply does not shrink in place. The issue is how brittle, how stiff, and how much will it induce further fracturing. I don't know, except I have cast out small coupons of wood flour and the epoxy, and it does seem to be reasonably flexible. For how long, I'm not entirely sure, but I've been looking on some projects that have been worked on that are many, many years old, and they still maintain that characteristic. This is not a panel painting, but it is an example of where I was able to exploit and learn something very important from this epoxy system. This is an actual barn that I bought in Illinois and had shipped to me in Virginia, and this is it almost reconstructed. But the issue was with these gigantic voids down here, just to give you some sense of scale. These are 8-inch by 10-inch timbers. So rather, on some of the timbers, I actually did recut replacements, but on this one, I decided I was going to try to actually cast in place an epoxy fill. Now, one of the issues, again, with epoxy is it tends to get very hard, and comparatively, it yields a margin, an interface that is very brittle and fracturable. So what I did was to take one of those timbers and actually, following the same type of approach, just made a box that was the right size. It's the mold into which I packed wood shavings, and into that I mixed up and poured epoxy. And epoxy of that mass gets so hot that it actually boils. And this epoxy was it's very hard to get a picture of boiling epoxy, I'll tell you, but I was actually able to get it to boil in place after filling it here. And I should back up and say I first sized all the surfaces with the epoxy just by itself. And since it was a fairly thin coat of epoxy wicking into the end, it actually penetrated very far into the wood. This is a case where I did want very, very deep penetration into the wood. But if I had achieved only an epoxy reconstructed element there that was the density of the epoxy, it would have been so hard and so dense it would have almost certainly fractured as soon as some number of stress cycles were placed on it. But in fact, because I got this to boil, it actually aerated itself. So it is an epoxy foam. It is a wood, well, I don't know if it's an impregnated epoxy or impregnated wood, but there is this mixture of wood shavings with aerated epoxy foam all in one. And the result of that was a material that had, from a working perspective and a tool perspective, such similarity to the wood itself, I have to think that it is got a better chance long haul. Now, admittedly, this is not likely that you're going to be pouring this into panel paintings, but, it is a useful thing to learn. And I can tell you that several years after the fact, this repair has remained intact with no fracture along the glue margin whatsoever. Now, an alternative would be this product that I have only recently come across. It is a marine-grade flexible epoxy, two-part material, which mixes like many other epoxies and works as a sort of a thin taffy consistency. So again, there are issues of its penetration and flow, but nevertheless, using a fairly large injector, I was able to press it down into the bottom of this panel. Again, I'd prepared a panel, snapped it in half, and then fixed it with a void in place. And at a particular moment in its hardening process, I used one of my homemade sort of skiving tools out of ivory and simply shaved off any excess, and it shaved off wonderfully cleanly. And in the end, you can see that, again, there is no void. Now, the manufacturer was, shall we say, reticent to share with me some of the formulation information on this particular product, but they did tell me that this remains flexible indefinitely. Now, I'm pretty sure their idea of indefinite and our idea of indefinite is different, but it is an area of investigation that I'm going to pursue a little bit more to see whether this material is something that is very much useful to us in terms of filling voids without inducing additional fracture later on. Now we're getting into the areas where I spend a lot of my time working on flexible fills right now. This is flexible reactive as opposed to rigid reactive. We're talking about RTV silicone, and I don't use much polyurethane, but I know that it is commensurate with RTV in many areas. Now, one of the things that I do a lot of times is when I'm faced with a substantial void and I cannot get to the back side of it to put some sort of a masking seal on the back side, I will take a piece of cotton string and simply stuff it down into the void as a gasket to seal the backside of the gasket. It also has a secondary benefit in just a moment. But I happen to find this an exceedingly useful technique for making sure that stuff doesn't leak out the bottom and all over everywhere. Now, this is especially useful when you cannot excavate the rear side of the fracture. Now, to get rid of the contaminants. In panel painting's term, the rear side is the painting itself and the contaminants are the paint. So I'm guessing you're not going to want to excavate that off of the fracture in order to move forward with the repair. But again, injecting some of the silicone down into the void, I was able to get actually very, very deep penetration. This is a 1/2 inch thick piece of wood, and I was able to get it down all the way to the bottom. Now, one of the issues with RTV silicone is that its surface tension does not really make itself amenable to overpainting. And remember, one of our goals at the beginning was to lay a foundation for what comes next. So what I've done in recent work, and actually in treatments as well, is to, when I have the fill done and the topography is the same, I will actually brush in and pounce in pigment to give tooth to what's going to come next. Otherwise, you could have some cleavage problems. I've also found that waxed shellac sticks just fine to this. But for the most part, if you're dealing with a painted or pigmented surface, you could just simply pounce dry pigment right into the surface and it would adhere. Now, here's the real glory of this particular technique. If you don't get it right, you can just peel it right out. And using a dental tool, I just usually snatch at the end of where the fill is, and I'll just snatch a little piece of the string, and the whole thing comes peeling right out with no damage whatsoever to the object. And in fact, this was an example where that needed to occur. This is obviously a cabinet with a very, very large split, which was not in plane. And there was no way to get access to it and bring it back into plane without wreaking havoc with the cabinet. So by just masking off the areas, filling the void first with a piece of string and then with the RTV silicone, and then putting in the colorant. And if you get a sense of that color and the sense of this, you know right from the start the color is wrong. So in fact, in this particular instance, we got to the point where we just couldn't get the color to match, and we literally did peel out the repair and start all over again. But in the end, we were able to get it fairly close, and certainly from an exhibition and viewing distance, the more disturbing thing is the fact that these two panels are not in plane rather than the color. It's a really nice approach to getting something that is entirely flexible. It will expand and compress far more extensively than will the wood or any relative humidity fluctuations we would get in the galleries. And I think that it is one very, very positive solution that I have used for areas of fill repair. Now, admittedly, this is not going to be a high tensile strength, high adhesive, robust sort of system. This is primarily where I'm looking for something that's going to hold things steady and provide some filling on top of which later treatment can occur. Now, we're getting to my favorite tool of all, molten EVA. Which is flexible. This is about a 20-year-old piece of EVA. It's still very flexible. If you feel the need to use a museum conservation grade hot melt glue gun, I'll be happy to send you one. Just send me the request on the back of a $50 bill and I'll send you one of these. Or you can go to the hardware store and buy a $3 15-watt unit for melting the glue and achieving the molten state necessary for it to get it to flow into the void. This particular brand is my favorite. It's very hard to come by. It's called Magic Melt Low Temp Non-Toxic Hot Melt Glue. It's primarily used for flower arranging. If you know of craft shops where they do arranging of dried flowers, this is the material very often. This particular one has an oval cross section, and when I first started using this material, I was casting some medallions for some gilded areas of a mirror. And I liked it because when I would cast medallions out of this material, I could burnish the gold directly into the surface of the dry, cooled EVA with no size, no nothing. I could burnish it up almost to a water gilded surface, and that was very intriguing to me, and I started using it for more and more things. Now, since in this particular case it's a very odd configuration of this, I made some molds, and I can make my own glue sticks now, or molten EVA fill sticks, if you will, and I can add pigment to them, I can add dyes to them, I can make them pretty much appear any way I want them to appear, which in my world is a very important kind of thing. Now, again, just taking the crack and the glue gun and just putting it in there, at some point you have to skive off any excess. This is my ivory tool, which is my favorite. This is my boxwood tool, which is another one. I have another tool that I've made out of a giant bamboo outer sheath that works very well. And this material just skives off just as clean as can be. It just really separates itself out, and then as it dries, or as it hardens from cooling, it becomes translucent. You can see there is no void whatsoever. And it's not always entirely clear, but because it's translucent, it begins to adopt some of the coloration of the surrounding substrate. In furniture, that's quite important. I don't know that it is so for panel paintings. But then you can bite back into this with any solvent-based seal coat that is something like some of the lower aromatics. Toluene works fine. Ethanol and propanol both bite into this fine. Acetone certainly. So you can bite back into it with subsequent coating materials and then go on from there. This is a real-life instance of where that material was exceedingly useful to me. This is a table, a small side table, that had fractured right along here at least 3 or 4 times. 2 minutes? Good. I only have 2 minutes of talking left, so we're just right on time. And it had been repaired a number of times, and I got it, and you can see the size of this void now. And I actually spent more time cleaning out the previous debris from choosing the wrong material. I sized the entire area with methyl cellulose because I was using a fairly high heat material, and I figure if methyl cellulose can hold the breading on your fish sticks at McDonald's, it can certainly deal with any glue that I'm putting in here. So I've input the material, I've skived it off very carefully. One of the things I like about ivory and wood or bamboo is that they can really cut these materials cleanly without scarring the surrounding surface. And as is my wont, I tend to do the final in-painting in place. And you can see that it's not completely disappeared, because I was like the third or fourth person to revisit this area, but it has diminished so that it can be exhibited without tremendous difficulty. So as we've looked just at a few things, hide glue, synthetic resin emulsions, rigid and flexible reactive systems, flexible phase change systems, I think that there's much area for us to be rich. And as I close with three hackneyed cliches, I think that as Dwayne was mentioning earlier this morning, there's a lot of materials that are in completely unrelated disciplines that if we went out and found them, we would find them to be exciting and useful for us. And I encourage you to do that. And if you find something that really excites you and is working well for your purposes, I'd love for you to let me know so I can add to my body of knowledge. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing all your experiences and your real-life knowledge about how to adhere and glue your objects and how to extract the remains. We are having a break now. I hope you've written down all the questions you want to put us later this afternoon, but we're having a break now, and we are going to commence here at 3:20, 3:20. Thank you very much.